Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Stephen Nelson, and I am Dean of the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts here at the National Gallery of Art. And I am delighted to welcome you to our third 75th A.W. Mellon Lecture in the Fine Arts, featuring Dr. Mabel O. Wilson from Columbia University. Let's welcome Dr. Wilson up to the lectern.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. So it's a pleasure to be here. I'm on the third, yay. And I just want to thank you all for coming. It's a beautiful day. The cherry blossoms are in bloom. But thank you for coming here this Sunday afternoon at the National Gallery's East Wing. One, I really do want to thank Billy, who is our ASL translator today. He did my first lecture, so please, yay. Give Billy a thank you. And I just want to say that the fine-tuned analysis of this talk, as I mentioned, this was it's a part of a larger book project, but this chapter in particular, I knew would be the hardest chapter to write because the way in which I've wanted to tell these stories. And so I would say the fine-tuned analysis of both Blackness and gender that threads through today's talk would not have been possible without the intellectual fellowship of a remarkable group of scholars and artists gathered together by Tina Campt and Saidiya Hartman. So I just wanted to thank that group for this, yes, and some cheers for that. Yay! I mean, you know their work, and it really is. I mean, it really is an incredible group of folks. So let's get started. So at the Democratic National Convention held in July of 2016, Michelle Obama delivered an inspiring speech to hundreds of attendees there to nominate Hillary Clinton as the party's presidential candidate. To the packed convention hall and to audiences around the world, Obama shared these poignant insights on being a Black mother who raised a family in the storied White House.
The story of generations of people who felt the lash of bondage, the shame of servitude, the sting of segregation, but who kept on striving and hoping and doing what needed to be done so that today I wake up every morning in a house that was built by slaves. And I watch my daughters, two beautiful, intelligent Black young women, playing with their dogs on the White House lawn.
I wanted to stop on the great John Lewis. So fact checks on Obama's startling claims about the revered residents of the nation's first family ricocheted furiously around the media sphere. One prominent commentator conceded that the First Lady had indeed stated a historical fact. She was essentially correct that enslaved workers had built the White House. He inserted the caveat, however, that the, quote, slaves that worked there had decent lodgings provided by the government, end quote. Now, one might interpret the phrase decent lodgings as a calculated effort to attempt to lessen the severity of enslavement. Provided by the government could also be read as evidence that Black people, even 18th century enslaved Africans, ones legally defined as property and violently held in captivity, had a propensity for depending upon the state's beneficence rather than their own resourcefulness and wherewithal for basic needs like shelter and food. And in many ways, these sentiments affirm what theorist Christina Sharp, who's one of the group, had poignantly observed, quote, how does one memorialize chattel slavery and its afterlives, which are still unfolding, end quote. Now, if you listen closely To Michelle Obama's speech, she offered a powerful corrective to these types of well-worn insinuations. She situated her revelations within an extending arc of history when she prefaced her stories about life in the White House with the recognition that anti-Black racism in the United States, the conditions of the lash of bondage, the shame of servitude, and the sting of segregation had defined the everyday struggles of Black folks for hundreds of years prior to the political and social advances catalyzed by the civil rights movement beginning in the 1950s. Those legal protections to ensure fair housing, equal access to education, and voting rights for everyone living in the US made it possible for her to have the unique experience of watching her daughters, Malia and Sasha, frolic with their dogs on the south lawn of the White House because her husband, Barack Obama, was twice elected to the presidency in 2008 and 2012. Michelle Obama concluded her story about the fight against injustice and efforts at national progress by emphasizing the universal shared experience of familial bonds that knitted the Obamas together, which included living with extended family like her mother, the late Marion Robinson, who joined them for 8 years in the White House. So my third Mellon lecture zooms in on one area in what is now Capitol Hill and what was then called Washington City. In what follows, I focus on early residents who designed, built, worked, and lived on F Street, Northwest, less than a quarter-mile east of the president's house, the same White House where Michelle Obama raised her daughter. A deep dive into the history of those blocks on Capitol Hill reveals the ways that enslaved and free Blacks became essential for the capital city's construction, from clearing the land to making the bricks, and for its maintenance, from repairs to care of its white population. Even the first residents of the president's house, that's Thomas Jefferson, James Monroe, James Madison, John Adams did not have enslaved, who were charged with guiding the development of the first self-governed democratic republic, lived in the splendid new neoclassical residence, the president's house, with their families whose daily lives depended upon enslaved servants. Historian Letitia Woods Brown reminds us that, quote, in the early decades, the district and its environs never quite abandoned the idea that slavery was primarily a right to service, perpetual or for a time, end quote. Today's lectures begin with a fragment of the story of one such person, an enslaved carpenter named Peter, last name and age unknown, who was owned by architect and builder of the president's house, James Hoban. Skilled at his trade, Peter was one of the anonymous slaves referenced in Michelle Obama's speech, tasked with building the White House. Besides the singular architectural vision of the building's design, typically documented by architectural historians, construction labor is also a critical factor for how buildings are erected. In a superb scholarship on the Nazi Party's use of forced labor, much of it conscripted from Jewish concentration camps, historian Paul Jascott makes the argument that a more complex analysis of the process of monumental building projects, quote, from inception to design to construction, end quote, can help us understand political history far better than a, quote, static evaluation of finished structures, end quote. If we were to examine a cadre of architects, builders, land speculators, public servants, and politicians invested in the construction of the city and who resided at the heart of the new federal city on F Street, what can we learn about how their cherished freedom, liberation guaranteed politically, economically, and legally, depended upon keeping Black residents, whether enslaved like Peter or free, in circumstances of unfreedom in Washington City and the nation? The ad in the Charleston City Gazette read, quote, absented himself on Sunday, the 4th instant, a Negro fellow named Peter, by trade a carpenter, end quote. Peter sought freedom by fleeing his owner, James Hoban, an Irish architect, master carpenter, and tradesman. Peter had absented himself, that is, withdrawn or removed his person on January 4th, 1789, from the possession of Hoban in the city of Charleston. Absenting from possession, or stealing away, as scholar Saidiya Hartman pinpoints, was, quote, synonymous with defiance because it necessarily involved the seizing of the master's property and asserting his self in transgression of the law, end quote. Hoban's use of a slave's first name only in the advertisement enacted his proprietary right to disavow Peter's social relationships and bonds of kinship to render Peter as his property. The absence of Peter's surname eradicated family history along with any ties to place of origin or claims to inheritance. With no last name, Peter had no kin, no mother, father, sister, brother, wife, child, and so on to claim as a familial or social relation. It meant that legally Peter belonged to Hoban and no one else, and in turn, little, if nothing, belonged to Peter. This erasure and theft provided one method of many other violent tactics that enslavers practiced to assert their legal control over humans as fungible, that is, exchangeable commodities at the service of their use and pleasure, hallmarks of all property. In last week's lecture, I discussed how property ownership of land and humans was foundational to the modern political project of both nation and citizen. Now, as a means to find their lost property, enslavers who placed advertisements to alert the public about runaway slaves typically described in great detail the character and dress of the enslaved person in order to distinguish him or her for recapture. Placed almost 2 weeks after Peter sought his freedom, Hoban's ad in the City Gazette conveyed that when Peter fled, he was closely pursued. In Hoban's published narrative, as Peter ran away, he lost a shoe. Because slave owners needed to affirm their mastery by denigrating some mental or physical characteristic of their missing property, Hoban chose to comment on the size of Peter's feet by highlighting them as, quote, being remarkably large, he cannot easily be fitted, which causes him to go barefooted, end quote. So to characterize Peter as hulking and shoeless, which is a point I will return to later, rendered Peter as sluggish and awkward rather than sharp and nimble. Remarkably large and barefooted conjured stereotypes of a grotesque black brute and an uncivilized African savage. Now, sluggishness and awkward aside, Peter had the acuity, like Hoban, to learn the skills of a carpenter. Moreover, Peter was apparently cunning enough to flee on a Sunday when he may have been under less scrutiny by Hoban and others. Peter astutely planned to escape on a day when enslaved men and women were often given the time to tend personal gardens, which were a source of both sustenance and money, engage in their own social activities like courting or communal celebrations, or attend religious services if permitted. And because he lived in an urban setting, Peter was not dressed in the coarsest Osnaburg linen that some slave owners purchased to clothe their plantation field workers and house servants. Osnaburg was a signifier of enslavement. And as I pointed out in last week's lecture about the clothing of the enslaved servant Christopher Shields, who appeared in Edward Savage's panoramic painting of the Washingtons. Perhaps proud of his status as a craftsman and in possession of his own monies from his skills, Peter, as Hoban's ad explains, wore a daily uniform of a coatee, which was a short brown jacket. He wore beige breeches, either made of corduroy or nanking, a yellowish cotton fabric from China that circulated by colonial trade routes to the Far East, and a tricorn hat. And these clothes, average for any mechanic or craftsman of that period, it would be easy for Peter to pass for a free person outside of Charleston, particularly without the identifier of his slave badge. If he were able to abscond to northern states, Peter could secure employment through his carpentry skills. Now, we don't know why Peter absented himself. It is possible that Peter observed that Hoban had been distracted during a period when he and his business partner and fellow Irishman, Pierce Purcell, were negotiating to purchase the 2 building lots in Charleston, and that this was the best opportunity to flee in haste. Or perhaps Peter could have been concerned that hearing upon the need for money to purchase the parcels and build a large structure for a residence, office, and shop, that he may need to be sold to raise capital. If sold, he would be separated from his community. Thus, living elsewhere as a fugitive may have been a more desirable prospect to Peter than living on a plantation far from who and where he called home. Now, if we can assume this runaway is the same Negro Peter that appeared on timesheets for the carpenters working at the president's house in February of 1795, then Peter was recaptured and returned, but we do not know when. We also do not have evidence to determine if Peter was returned to Hoban, who possibly lived at 30 Union Street, or was he sent to Charleston's infamous workhouse that the advertisement lists as an option for where to bring him once recaptured? The notorious Charleston workhouse, because it had once housed a sugar refining factory, was somehow referred to as the Sugar House, a cruel moniker given its carceral purpose and its plantation-related history. By contrast, free or indentured white people accused of criminal activities found themselves held in Charleston's jail. In practice, enslavers like Hoban had to pay the workhouse's warden for the period of incarceration. At the owner's behest, the warden and his staff would mete out punishments in the form of lashes or other techniques of pain and exhaustion to deter future aspirations of flight. Clearly, in selecting the workhouse, Hoban comprehended the scope of violence that was necessary to keep Peter captive as his personal property. Peter was the forced labor that not only built Hoban's architecture, but also his wealth and his reputation. An Irish immigrant, Hoban was not landed gentry like Thomas Jefferson, the self-taught architect of the Virginia State House that I spoke about in my first lecture, and the key instigator as Secretary of State with President George Washington of the location of the federal territory and the plan of the federal city. Hoban grew up in a tenant family who lived on the Desart estate in County Kilkenny, Ireland. Unlike the wealthy planter Jefferson, who was educated in law at William and Mary, Hoban apprenticed as a carpenter and a wheelwright on the estate. Now, in his teen years, the exceptionally talented Hoban left for professional training at the Dublin Society of Architecture Drawing, where he was schooled in the arts of orthographic drawing, the craft of architectural detailing and ornamentation, and the history of classicism. Sometimes around 1785 or so, Hoban immigrated to Philadelphia, the second largest city after New York at the time. Now, for reasons again unknown, 2 years later, Hoban moved to Charleston, South Carolina, which was home to a large population of Irish and Catholics, and which may have included family already in residence, like his brother Joseph. In Charleston, Hoban established a practice as an architect and a builder by partnering with the older Irish tradesman Purcell, who may, some historians believe, may have been a distant relative. Now, in the wake of the War for Independence, Charleston's bustling port remained tethered to the triangular trade between Europe, the Caribbean, and Africa, with ships arriving daily to unload and discharge cargoes, to load and discharge cargoes of rice, corn, indigo, and slaves. Charleston's booming mercantile economy made it the fourth largest city in the US at the time. Now, even though the South Carolina General Assembly halted the importation of slaves from other states and foreign regions from March 1787 to March 1790, in part to mitigate the debts owned by planters, the region was nonetheless highly dependent on enslaved labor for the range of tasks required in large-scale plantation operations. Now, if we look closely at who lived in Charleston in 1790, the federal census counted 8,089 white residents and roughly 8,200 Black residents, with approximately 7,600 of those enslaved, though this number was probably an undercount. Integral to Charleston's trade and agricultural economy, the city's Black residents, with around 600 free Blacks, outnumbered the city's white residents. To regulate the mobility of enslaved and free people, in part out of a fear of uprisings like the Stono Rebellion 50 years before, the county government instituted a slave badge system. To secure an identification badge for their property, slave owners paid a fee, which then allowed them to rent out their captive workers. These new laws also placed restrictions on the ability of enslaved men and women to work for additional wages or sell goods, like produce from their gardens, which enabled them to buy their freedom and the freedom of family members. And if you notice on the free badge, you will see a pileus, which I talked about at the first lecture, and a rod. So this was always a common symbol, right, of that came from classicism to represent free people who had been enslaved but who are now free. Now, interestingly, under South Carolina law, Hoban and Purcell could train enslaved workers like Peter in carpentry, but enslaved workers could not teach each other in the trades. In other words, enslavers could improve their property, that is your right as a property owner to improve it, hence its value, but slaves could not legally self-improve by learning skills that included how to read and write. Now, despite these regulations, which in part protected the wages of free white workers, like these carpenters who were advertised by Hoban and Purcell, one avenue for white mechanics in the building trades like Hoban and Purcell, carpenters, brick masons, brickmakers, and glazers, was to purchase and train their own enslaved workforce. Perhaps this is why and how James Hoban, carpenter from Kilkenny, architect in Charleston, came to own Peter, last name unknown. Now, Hoban and Purcell's splendid new house at 43 Trott Street was home to two other white males, probably Purcell's brother Redmond and Hoban's brother Joseph. Both were carpenters who would eventually migrate to Washington City. Now, along with the men, two white females resided in the three-story brick house. They may have been Pierce Purcell's wife and Hoban's sister. The 1790 census schedules also listed two enslaved persons, whose genders are unknown, living in the house. One was most likely a black female house servant, purchased or rented to cook and clean. The other slave living in the house, in the attic, or in the vicinity, a permissible situation called living out, may have been Hoban's enslaved carpenter, Peter. We do not know if Hoban and Purcell's other enslaved carpenters, named Ben, Daniel, Harry, James, Tom, or Tony, were purchased in Charleston before being transported to Washington City to build the president's house and the US Capitol. Now, just as planning for the Capitol was underway, President Washington took a tour of the southern states in spring of 1791. For those who attended or listened to last week's Mellon Lecture, Washington made this trip after Andrew Ellicott had completed his survey and the three commissioners for public buildings had been selected. The trip south provided Washington with an opportunity to promote the new federal city and future investment in the city's lots that would be auctioned the following year. The president arrived in Charleston in May, and General William Moultrie, a Revolutionary War general, two-time governor of South Carolina, hosted his friend and fellow patriot. Of Scottish descent, Moultrie, like the president, owned extensive acreage in rice plantations, worked by 77 slaves, and a house in town, in Charleston, where 18 slaves served him and his family. At one of these festive events, it is believed that Moultrie, Jacob Reed, seen here, who is a lawyer, future US senator, planter, and enslaver, and Henry Lawrence introduced James Hoban to the president. Now, a close friend of Washington, Lawrence was a highly decorated revolutionary patriot who had been a peace commissioner assigned to negotiate the Treaty of Paris in 1783 that ended the War for Independence. And you could see him in the red in the back in this unfinished Benjamin West painting. Now, Lawrence had accumulated vast acreage in South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. In nearby St. John's Parish, for example, Lawrence plantation, Mepkin, a rice plantation, was worked by 297 enslaved men, women, and children. Earlier in his career, and you could see Lawrence Wharf here, Lawrence had quit the risky and what he believed to be morally fraught slave trade by dissolving his mercantile trading firm, Austin and Lawrence, in 1762. But why? In one cargo of 195 slaves transported from Calabar, Nigeria, on the King David, owned by Walter Lauer and originating in Bristol, their September 1756 ledger entry notes, for example, that, quote, almost all the slaves after the first day's sale were swelted or in other ways disordered, and great numbers of them are since dead. Of the 56 sold after vendu, which is the name for auction, there are but few now alive, end quote. Nonetheless, despite the miserable death of 56 men, women, and children in one cargo, Lawrence remained financially invested. Their commission was 1,737 pounds, and Lauer netted 31,092 pounds. And Lawrence remained wholly dependent on what he saw as racially inferior Negroes. For Lawrence, much like Jefferson's inclinations, enslaved blacks were best suited to work his land and cater to the needs of his family and friends. Now, one of the most wealthy men in the US, Lawrence became the chief financial patron to rebuild the Charleston City Courthouse, a redesign undertaken by Hoban. Their illustrious careers as patriots, politicians, lawyers, planters, and merchant traders made South Carolinians, Moultrie, Reed, and Lawrence influential national figures whose likenesses are immortalized by the important painters of the day: Charles Wilson Peale, John Trumbull, Benjamin West, John Singleton Copley. The great wealth garnered from their vast plantation networks, slaveholding, and the trade of commodities like rice, indigo, cotton, and slaves financed the burgeoning careers of architects like Hoban, who became a US citizen in 1791. So the prospect of securing work at one of the largest design and construction projects undertaken in the new nation, Washington City, caught the entrepreneurial, now Irish-American architect and builder's interest. Now, in the early years of the federal city's construction, Secretary of State Jefferson advised on the overall planning of the city. President Washington took a keen interest in the design and construction of the President's House in the US Capitol. Both Jefferson and Washington worked closely with the three commissioners of the federal buildings, which I talked about last week, but I just want to identify them again. One was Thomas Johnson, a First Continental Congress delegate, judge, planter, and Maryland's first governor. Daniel Carroll Jr., a former Maryland congressional representative and signatory of the Constitution, and planter from a prominent Catholic family, and David Stewart, a planter and lawyer from Virginia, who was George Washington's step-son-in-law, and he was the father of Wash and Nellie in the painting by Savage. Now, as the architect of the newly completed Virginia State House, Jefferson wanted to ensure that the quality of the designs of the two main buildings displayed the proper proportion and details of the best classical architecture and responded to the needs of the new government, and was affordably erected with available materials and available labor. In March of 1792, Jefferson drafted a call for architects to submit plans, elevations, and an estimation of the cost of the brickwork for the President's House and the US Capitol. The commissioners placed the advertisement for the design competition in newspapers in major cities. The architects who won would be awarded a lot in the new city and a prize of $500 or a medal of the same value. The runner-up would also receive a $500 prize. Now, these alluring prizes and prospects of new work made Hoban eager to promote his unique abilities. So he traveled to Philadelphia to meet again with President Washington in late spring of 1792. Hoban secured a letter from Washington to the commissioners recommending his designs. Now, another Charlestonian, Adenis Burke, an Irish-born lawyer, judge, and politician, also wrote a letter in May of 1792 to Commissioner Carroll, a fellow Catholic of Irish descent. And Burke praised Hoban's talents. Hoban's arrival to Washington City followed, actually, Pierce Purcell, who had already visited and been introduced to Carroll through Jacob Reed, who joined the chorus of Charlestonians who championed the architectural talents of Hoban. So even back then, architects networked with great zeal to secure new commissions. So not much has changed in the modern profession of architects. And Hoban was actually really talented for someone of his age, but he also had other talents as well. Now, 4 months later, on July 17th of 1792, Washington and the commissioners awarded Hoban first place for his design of the President's House. Hoban accepted enthusiastically the commission, the free lot in the new city, and the medal. He didn't take the cash. Who knows why? Now, architectural historians have pointed out that Hoban modeled his design on Leinster House in Dublin, a precedent that he combined with a plate from William Gibbs' book on architecture. You could see that Leinster House was also a kind of model for the Charleston courthouse. His winning design offered a 3-story, this is not the winning design on the left, this is a revision of it, but the winning design offered a 3-story Neo-Palladian house adorned with the Ionic order, with a rusticated 3-bay entrance on the north elevation. To Jefferson, who may have weighed in on the selection, this was probably a, quote, morsel of good taste, end quote, that would be a model of the architecture suitable for the new government, one that would receive high praise from discerning Europeans. Now, Hoban's design was later modified with input from Washington, reducing it to the 2-story edifice in part because of the difficulty of procuring stone. Now, aesthetically, Hoban's deployment of the Ionic order lent the President's House an ornamental flair that the more austere Doric order could not. And yet, it reflected Washington's preference for restrained elegance. Choosing the Ionic order also made it easier to find stonemasons with the skill to craft the order's signature volute, or spiral scroll. Because nothing of the scale and scope of the President's House and the US Capitol had ever been undertaken in the burgeoning nation, the commissioners and Hoban solicited agents to contact stone carvers and other skilled construction workers from Europe. That effort failed. So they tapped into a regional network of craftsmen and laborers, many of whom were enslaved. Now, for the location of the President's House, architect and surveyor Pierre Lafont chose high ground in what was formerly what was called David Byrne's plantation. Wealthy planters in the Tidewater region, like Washington at Mount Vernon, typically sited their houses on high ground that overlooked the rivers, their lifelines of commerce and their vast acreage. In the 1830s, writer and editor Nathaniel Parker Willis observed that the President's House, quote, resembles the country seat of an English nobleman in architecture and size. It is commodious and credible building, serving its purpose without too much state for a republican country, yet likely as long as the country exists without primogeniture and rank, to be sufficiently superior to all other dwelling houses to mark it as the residence of the nation's ruler, end quote. Atop a commanding Capitol Hill prospect, the President's House affinity with the aesthetics and landscape of plantation houses symbolized how state property and private land ownership were intertwined. And to be sure, the President's House architects, like the local plantation homes that dotted the promontories along the Potomac shores, were built and maintained by thousands of enslaved laborers. So by winning the top award for the President's House, beating out Jefferson's own Palladian effort, oh, not so great. This was not his best. Hoban's architectural abilities proved him as talented as the other immigrant architects, William Thornton of Tortuga, London, or Stephen Halley of London, Italy, who vied for the winning design of the more programmatically complex US Capitol building. Sorry, Stephen Halley should be French, sorry. Though none of them was perhaps as well trained as the English architects George Hadfield or Benjamin Henry Latrobe, who would eventually design large sections of the US Capitol. Competitively, Hoban's skill as a builder that proved him to be an invaluable addition to the team in charge of building the new federal city. He was more knowledgeable than most, including the commissioners, about the construction process. He knew how to estimate the cost and the procurement of materials and the proper supervision and sequencing of the various trades. Himself an enslaver, Hoban could work with overseers. He could confidentially supervise the teams of free, indentured, and enslaved laborers involved in the varied construction. And therefore, in need of Hoban's wide-ranging abilities, the commissioners also hired him to superintend the construction of the President's House. And Hoban would continue to work on buildings throughout, particularly government buildings, over the course of his life and residency in the city until he died. Now, over its 10-year construction period, Hoban thrived in the muck and chaos of Washington City. To complete carpentry work and a host of other trades and transactions, Hoban relied on 4 or more hands of enslaved craftsmen, including his carpenter, Peter. As mentioned previously, Peter appeared regularly in the timesheets of the President's House beginning in February of 1795. Builder Pierce Purcell was put in charge of the carpenters that included, if you note, Joseph Hoban, the architect's younger brother. Purcell's brother, Redmond Purcell, supervised the carpenters at the US Capitol. At the job site of the President's House, Peter worked alongside Harry, Daniel, and Ben, who were enslaved by Hoban. Pierce Purcell owned Tom, James, and Tony. And I will talk about James in my 4th lecture. He has a very interesting story. The carpenters erected scaffolding for the bricklayers and the stonemasons. Other tasks included in building interior walls within the brick structural shell of the main building and installing roof rafters. According to payroll documents, for 26 days of work per month, Peter and Tom, for example, earned close to what white carpenters, included indentured ones, were paid. But unlike free carpenters, Hoban and Purcell collected their wages. Beginning in 1795 to expedite the construction schedule, Hoban routinely hired enslaved sawyers in charge of cutting and preparing lumber at both sites. And because they worked additional hours on Sundays, Hoban allowed the sawyers to keep their wages rather than give it to their enslavers. So Peter and other carpenters owned by Hoban and Purcell worked at the federal job sites until sometime in November of 1797, when the ambitious large-scale construction initiative began to experience cash flow problems due to errant land speculators and other fraud schemes that delayed payments for labor and materials. So the commissioners issued a new rule that, quote, no Negro carpenters or apprentices be hired at either of the public buildings, end quote. This terminated the work of enslaved carpenters Peter, Ben, Daniel, Harry, James, Tom, and Tony at the President's House and US Capitol. This ban also applied to most of the enslaved and also to the white indentured hires at both sites and other construction projects around the city because they were clearing land, they were cutting roadways, and other parts of the city. So in this way, the construction teams transitioned to a majority free white skilled and unskilled labor force with a few free black workers hired on a regular basis. This change in hires occurred as new construction projects in the city, such as the Treasury Office on the east side of the President's House and the War Office on the west side of the President's House, were added to the commissioner's oversight. In his ascent to power as the master builder of Washington City, Hoban built professional networks among the white elites and tradesmen, despite numerous setbacks in his relationships with the commissioners. Peter, however, never appeared on the carpenter's timesheets again after November 1797. His fate remains unknown. If Peter and the other enslaved workers were transported by Hoban and Purcell, how did other enslaved workers who worked alongside them end up in Washington City? To find resources for construction, including timber for scaffolding and flooring, the commissioners tapped into local labor and materials markets, ones that depended upon the plantation network of enslaved labor that moved commodities, including raw and finished goods, within the transatlantic mercantile capitalist economy. Materials like timber and lime and clay and sand, stone, nails, plate glass, and more had to be either made or procured to begin construction, and workers, both skilled and unskilled, were needed for the many tasks. The commissioners posted an advertisement in the Maryland Herald and Eastern Shore Intelligencer newspaper on November 11th of 1794, and it said, quote, "Wanted at the city of Washington, a number of slaves to labor in the brickyards, stone quarries, for which generous wages will be given to the enslavers. Also sawyers to saw by the hundred or on wages by the month or year. Apply to Mr. Hoban or Captain Elisha O. Williams," end quote. Yet the practices of procuring enslaved carpenters, sawyers, brickmakers, and others from slave owners in the region was an uneven process, and as historian Bob Arnebeck astutely noted, it did not happen overnight. And Arnebeck wrote an extraordinary book called Through a Fiery Trail that covers the entire process. I mean, it's about that thick, and it's amazing this city ever got built. He also wrote an amazing second book called Slave Labor in the Capital. So if you really want to get into this question, I highly recommend Arnebeck's excellent book, very thorough. So in the slave hire system, based on the labor procurement networks developed by the Potomac Company discussed last week, the commissioners fed and housed the enslaved workers who lived alongside white Irish, Scottish, and American workers in the temporary camps erected on the squares near the President's House in the US Capitol, which probably included Peter and the other enslaved carpenters. Everyone was fed the same basic diet of cornmeal, bread, salted beef, seasonal shad, rum on occasion. And the commissioner's spring 1792 letter to one of the field organizer, Captain O. Williams, requested that he, quote, "hire good laboring Negroes by the year, the masters clothing them well and finding each a blanket, the commissioners finding them provisions and paying 20 on pounds a year," end quote. Now, one of the last invoices sent and paid to the second cohort of commissioners of public buildings, and these were William Thornton, a physician planter from Tortola, self-taught architect of the US Capitol and Philadelphia's Library Company, which I talked about in my first lecture, and I'll go back to Thornton on the fourth lecture. Gustavus Scott, who was a Maryland lawyer, former member of the Confederate Congress, and a Potomac Company investor, and Alexander White, a Virginia planter and lawyer. And that invoice was for 11 pairs of what were called Negro shoes. Now, the clothing was purchased for enslaved laborers who finished construction tasks at the President's house from September of 1799 to March of 1800. The invoice came from Thomas Corcoran, a local merchant who traded in tobacco and grains. Corcoran, who had immigrated from Ireland to Maryland 30 years before, served as Georgetown's first mayor, beginning in 1795. He would become, at the time, one of the wealthiest residents, and in part, the money came from land speculation in Washington City. Now, upon closer inspection of Corcoran's invoice, each of the 11 lines provides a date, the pair of shoes given to each enslaved man: Ned, Joseph, Harry, Edward, Jacob, Salisbury, another Ned by a different owner, and Sam. This was followed by the last name of their enslaver: Walker, Blake, Briscoe, Stone, Brent. The shoe price was deducted from the wages. Quote, December 13th, for Negro Harry, the property of Miss E. Brent, 11 shillings and 3 pence. Now, Harry also received shoes on March 19th, 1800, and other workers named Ned and Jacob also appeared twice. The repeat purchases perhaps indicate that the construction tasks during the 6-day work week may have been arduous. It may have been strategic to purchase leather pump, slip-on type shoes that quickly fall apart on rough roads or forest paths in order to avert escape attempts. In Harry's case, fragile shoes may have prevented him from fleeing north to places like Philadelphia, with its growing population of free blacks, as discussed in last week's lecture, or south to his community 40 miles in Charles County. In a similar manner, Peter's barefoot condition may not have been because of his allegedly large feet, as pointed out in Hoban's notice, but because of the deliberate poor quality of Negro shoes purchased by the architect. The production and purchase of slave clothing and shoes created an identifiable sign of enslaved status. Importantly, the clothing's poor quality showed a disinvestment in their humanness, despite the fact that these men and boys represented an enormous financial investment in the slave's labor potential. Now, Corcoran's invoice also registered the routine disregard for each man's humanity through the racialized title Negro, and the eradication of kinship through the absence of a last name replaced by property of. The invoice designated that, for example, Harry was not a self-possessed subject and thus could not claim status as a son, a husband, or citizen, at least defined by US law and custom. In contrast, the invoice records Harry's enslaver, a well-off white landowner, Elizabeth Brent, who received the slaves Harry, Gabriel, and Fanny from the estate of her father, Robert Brent, in 1788, with a different protocol of status and belonging. The invoice identified her by the title of Miss and her kinship as a member of the Brent family, a name associated with the early English Catholic settlers of the region. It would seem that Harry, whose age was unknown, as are the specific tasks he undertook for the wages collected by his owner, Miss Brent, was one of the last what were called Negro hires by the commissioners. Harry worked as a laborer, perhaps clearing and loading construction wastes into carts at the President's house through August of 1800, 3 months before Congress arrived. Now, in the planters' invoices and in the commissioner's ledgers and journals and daybooks, the term Negro hire identified transactions contracting the labor of enslaved workers from nearby planters, tradesmen, and builders. On the timesheets, these types of hires were listed by the first name, typically preceded by in or Negro. The commissioners hired Harry from Eliza Brent, for example, on a quarterly basis. Her Negro hires, along with those of her 4 sisters, her Charles County neighbors, were first recorded in November of 1795. Now, this arrangement may have commenced earlier, but record keeping between 1791 and 1795 seems to be sporadic and not really in the archives. Now, because tobacco, a labor-intensive crop, had exhausted the tidewater soil of its nutrients, planters were forced to switch to grains, a crop that required fewer field hands and a different harvest schedule. By the late 18th century, Maryland's plantation owners needed fewer slaves to work their fields and operations. Some opted to hire out their skilled and unskilled slaves to work on the construction of Washington City, which provided at least 10 years of steady earnings. Others opted to sell their human property in slave markets in places like Baltimore and Alexandria, and to slave traders from the South. Once sold, they would be sent to large plantations spreading across the South, a topic I will address in my 4th Mellon lecture. So enslaved men like Harry and Peter, who constructed the president's house, formed a labor market that sustained the wealth of old family, like the Brent sisters, and also built the wealth of newcomers, like Hoban and Purcell. Enterprising merchants like Corcoran, who also had slaves, I should say, recognized the lucrative trade and commerce markets also emerged during the 10-year construction period of the new federal city. Just as important was the 3rd lucrative market in Washington City that formed around land speculation on the 1,000 or more lots sold by the commissioner's auction. And much like the labor and commerce markets, the purchase and development of lots to build needed residents and hotels and taverns and shops and banks and stables, also depended on the work of enslaved men, women, and children. Now, on the last page of Georgetown's Columbian Chronicle of March 13th, 1795 issue appeared an advertisement for the Little Hotel. Quote, "Little Hotel. The subscriber informs his friends and the public in general that the Little Hotel in the city of Washington is again open for their accommodation. William Coughlin," end quote. Now, a nota bene made an additional solicitation, quote, "Wanted to hire by the year a Negro man as a hostler," that's the person who takes care of the horses, "and a Negro woman who understands housework and plain cooking. For such, if well recommended, generous wages will be given. W.C., again, William Coughlin. Now of note, Coughlin was a glazier and a collaborator of Hoban and Purcell, who had also come from Charleston to work on the new federal buildings. And Hoban, Purcell, and Coughlin had worked together in Charleston. The Little Hotel's advertisement to rent an enslaved female domestic servant and a male to stable horses from a local plantation owner or a merchant or tradesman reveals how enslaved women were essential to servicing for a multiplicity of needs while Washington City was under construction. By law and in practice, the enslaved lived with their owners either in the house, or as one observer visiting the city in 1815, this is later, noted that, quote, "In some of the taverns, they, slaves, sleep on the floor of the dining room, which the master for obvious reasons ought to forbid," end quote. Enslaved servants and workers resided in the garret, or the attic, in a room at the rear of the building, or in a separate structure behind the house off the alley. Living in the alley, which was a very specific feature of the block design of the city, allowed free and enslaved Black residents to find that they could move about without being subject to harassment after evening curfews were established by the stringent Maryland slave codes. Now, Hoban built the Little Hotel on Block 224, just east of the President's house, on lots along F Street that he, Purcell, and Coughlin had purchased in the Washington City Lottery held on October 8th, 1792. So these are like the first couple of auctions. Hoban astutely recognized that the need for temporary housing for officials and architects and builders and investors and workers as the city took shape, whose population in 1793 numbered only about 300, not accounting enslaved residents. The flurry of building activities, governmental, commercial, residential, and infrastructural projects, along with land speculation, stoked a rapid growth in the number of people arriving to the region for work and profit. Now, the Little Hotel, with its 10 rooms, kitchen, 20 stables for horses, along with a staff of enslaved workers, responded to the growing need for places to stay. Hoban routinely purchased lots with his earnings. On his lots, the architect erected 2- and 3-story brick row houses around the city that he rented. So, for example, Commissioners Thornton, Scott, and Carroll moved their offices in the spring of 1795 from Georgetown to a building owned by Hoban near the Little Hotel on F Street. Hoban built his own home on the same block, 224, as the Little Hotel, to be closer to the activity on the 2 federal sites and to be amid his various private projects under construction. Most of the commissioners also bought and sold lots, in part to instill confidence in investment in the new city, and it should be noted, as I think I said last week, that George Washington also purchased lots during his presidency. Now, in February of 1805, Hoban placed an advertisement that appeared once in the National Intelligencer. He offered for sale an enslaved family, an unnamed woman aged 33 and her 3 young children. As a means to prevent the burgeoning capital city from becoming a slave market like Alexandria, by law, slaves could not be sold in Washington City or Maryland unless the seller had been resident for at least 3 years. Now, the enslaved woman may have been a cook or a domestic at the Little Hotel, which Hoban put up for sale 6 months earlier. Or she may have been a household servant for the Hoban family. Now, it is possible that Hoban placed the notice for someone else. We do not know who the father of her children might have been, and if he too were enslaved, or if he had already been sold. The father could have also been white, given the histories of predatory rape, also the histories of enslaved women also being sex workers. And therefore, the father, had he been white, would have renounced all kinship as laws and customs necessitated. There is no way of knowing her name or fate, as the ad gives no further detail. But the sale reminds us what historian Tamika Nunley observes about Washington City in these early years, that, quote, early investment in enslaved women's labor served the purposes of increasing investment in the city and developing social relations in the nation's capital, end quote. Lastly, Hoban remained in residence in the brick house he built on F Street till he died December 1831 at age 72. 3.5 months later, his son, James Hoban Jr., a highly respected attorney, placed a notice in the National Intelligencer announcing for sale an entire, quote, family of most likely healthy and valuable Negroes, end quote. In other words, these 7 slaves have a high probability, most likely, of being a good investment for future work given the soundness of their bodies. Again, Kinship was not specified other than two women, quote, about 30 or 50 years old. One of them has a young child, end quote. Also for sale in the lot were, quote, 5 males from 12 to 18 years old, some of them good house servants, end quote. No names, no birth dates, no kinship relations specified, such as they belong to no one other than the Hoban heirs. We do not know if any of these men, women, or children were related to the carpenter Peter, last name unknown. Ultimately, the free citizens who imagined and built the city that was home to the first self-governed democratic republic depended upon and profited from enslaved people who were subjected by law and custom to a lifetime predicament of unfreedom. Thank you.
Thank you for being with us this afternoon. I hope you enjoy the rest of your Sunday. And I hope you join us for Professor Wilson's fourth and final lecture next week. Same bat time, same bat channel. All right? Enjoy the rest of your weekend.